Albert Mohler, who is president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, made this comment just a few months ago. A remarkable cultural shift has taken place around us. The most basic contours of American culture have been radically altered. The so-called Judeo-Christian consensus of the last millennium has given way to a postmodern, post-Christian, post-Western cultural crisis which threatens the very heart of our culture. That's a pretty accurate analysis of what's going on in our country, and it's also happened in Europe, Western Europe, where Christianity once had such a powerful cultural influence. But the question is, why has that happened? About 20 years ago, almost 25 years ago, a book was written by the agnostic scientist Michael Denton from Australia. Actually, I think he's from New Zealand, but he was a medical doctor and a PhD molecular biologist. And he wrote the book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. And he doesn't discuss any Bible verses. He just discusses paleontology and molecular biology and biology. And this is one of his conclusions at the end of the book. Today, it is perhaps the Darwinian view of nature more than any other that is responsible for the agnostic and skeptical outlook of the 20th century. Pretty profound insight, I would say, from someone who's not a professing Christian. And I think he's absolutely right. So I've had the privilege of speaking on this subject in 19 countries. I have seen over and over again the pervasive worldwide impact of Darwinian evolution. And this year of 2009, is the year of Darwin. And people all over the world, evolutionists, are celebrating the 150th anniversary of the publication of his famous book, Origin of Species, and the 200th anniversary of his birth. And there was a big display in London at the Natural History Museum. Darwin, big idea, big exhibition. And on that huge sign, they made this statement: Darwin had a big idea, an idea that would transform our understanding of the natural world. But he kept it a secret for over 20 years, concerned about the controversy it would cause. It's like confessing to a murder, he wrote, 15 years before finding the courage to publish on the origin of species. It's like confessing to a murder. He killed something. What did he kill? The plaque goes on to say that following Darwin's Beagle voyage, you can journey through the story of evolution, discover why Charles Darwin, reluctant revolutionary, profoundly altered our view of the natural world and our place in it. A reluctant revolutionary? Well, maybe he was a little reluctant, but we need to look at Charles Darwin, and we need to look at the murder that he caused. He said this in 1828. This was in his autobiography, reflecting on the fact that he had gone to medical school at Edinburgh University. He didn't like dissection, and so he decided that wasn't the field for him. And so his father wanted him to have a respectable profession, and so his father wanted him to go to Cambridge to study theology. Now, his father was not a believer, his grandfather was an atheist, and his mother was a Unitarian. So he didn't exactly grow up in an Orthodox Christian home. And so he pondered this request of his father, and he asked for some time, he said, to consider. As from what little I had heard and thought on the subject, I had scruples about declaring my belief in all the dogmas of the Church of England, which you had to do to go to study at Cambridge at that time. Though otherwise, I liked the thought of being a country clergyman. Why did he like that thought? Well, to be a country clergyman in England in the 1800s was a very nice living. You lived comfortably, and to be a country clergyman, you would have lots of time to pursue your real interest, which in this case for him was the study of the natural world. So he liked that idea, but he goes on to say this: and as I did not then in the least doubt the strict and literal truth of every word of the Bible, I soon persuaded myself that our creed must be fully accepted. It never struck me how, illogical it was to say that I believed in what I could not understand and what is in fact unintelligible. Now we begin to see, and we'll see some more, the confusion in Darwin's mind. He didn't really believe in the strict and literal truth of every word of the Bible, as I will show you in just a moment. But if he did, that's not orthodox, because no Orthodox Christian believes every word is literal. There's poetic literature, there are parables, there are prophetic visions. But isn't it interesting that he could claim to believe in the literal truth of every word of the Bible, and yet in a very few sentences later say, I couldn't understand anything, and it's unintelligible? There's some confused thinking going on in Darwin's mind. Well, that was 1828. In his autobiography, he reflected back on the years 1836 to 1838, so just 10 years later, and he said this: during these 2 years, I was led to think much about religion. Whilst on board the Beagle, I was quite orthodox. That's his self-evaluation. Let's look at how orthodox he was. And I remember being heartily laughed at by several of the officers, though themselves orthodox. They were orthodox? While he said, for quoting, these orthodox seamen were laughing at him, the orthodox Christian, so to speak, for quoting the Bible as an unanswerable authority on some point of morality. Well, how orthodox were those seamen if they were scoffing at him? And what does that tell us about Darwin's definition of orthodoxy? But then he says, I suppose it was the novelty of the argument that amused them. But I had gradually come by this time, in 1836, to see that the Old Testament, from its manifestly false history of the world, with the Tower of Babel, the rainbow as a sign, etc., and from its attributing to God the feelings of a revengeful tyrant, was no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus or the beliefs of the barbarians. Now, how orthodox is that? The church was in the midst of compromising with millions of years at this time, but the church still believed that Genesis was history. Darwin wasn't orthodox at all. He was confused. And his ideas committed a murder. Well, in what sense am I thinking of that? It was in the influence of his ideas to produce an agnostic and skeptical outlook in once Christian cultures. So I want to look at 5 deaths that were caused by Darwin's theory. And they're not literal deaths, but I hope you'll understand my point here. And they are related to things that Darwinians believe about death. First, the death of the curse. The Darwinian revolution caused the death of the curse in the minds of many, many people. Carl Sagan, the great 20th century evolutionary astronomer, said, the secrets of evolution are time and death. Time for slow accumulations of favorable mutations, and death to make room for new species. The theory of evolution is built on the idea of death. And of course, we see death all around us. All of us will die someday if Jesus doesn't come before that. And sometimes that death is very tragic. The person who loses a little child early in life to death, or loses a spouse, and they shake their fist at God and they say, if you're so loving, why did you let my precious one die? You know, Darwin thought the same thing. Because in 1851, his precious daughter Annie died at the age of 11. Annie's death, Darwin's biographer said, her cruel death destroyed Charles' tatters of belief in a moral, just universe. Later, he would say that this period chimed the final death knell for his Christianity, even if it had been a long and drawn-out process of decay. Charles now took his stand as an unbeliever. Well, as we've already seen, Charles was not an Orthodox Christian. He never was. So it really wasn't the death knell of his Christianity, because he never really had Christianity. But it was the death of his daughter that caused him to reject belief in a moral, just universe. Well, what had he done? He had rejected the biblical view of the curse, because he had rejected the historicity of the early chapters of the Bible. And without that understanding of the curse, he couldn't make sense of his daughter's death. But it's not just human beings that die. We also see in the rock record fossils of former living things that have died by the billions and billions. Darwin also said in his Life and Letters, "I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God could have designedly created the Ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice." Well, I can't persuade myself of that either. That's the result of the fallen world. But you see, he had already rejected the curse on the creation. Because before he wrote his book and while he was studying theology, the idea of millions of years was developing to explain that fossil record. And so the evolutionary view built on that view of Earth history, and the evolutionary view is a view of death as the process for bringing creatures into existence. We as human beings are the result of a long process of millions of years of death of the unfit that gave way to the evolution of the fit. And that absolutely contradicts what the Bible has to say about death. The Bible says that God created a perfect world, a very good world, where there was no death, no human death, and as I'll explain in a moment, no animal death. And man sinned against God, and that brought death into the world because that brought the curse of God, not only on man, but on the whole creation. But Darwin rejected the curse, and he led many others to do the same. In Genesis 1, at the end of the sixth day of creation, God said to Adam, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you." So man was originally vegetarian. And then the next verse says, "And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth, which has life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. So this verse indicates that the animals were vegetarian. Now, many Christians today have accepted the millions of years of death and bloodshed and disease, and they will often criticize young earthers and say, "You say there was no death before the fall, but there was plant death because the creatures and man had to eat plants." And when they say that, it just shows they haven't looked very carefully at this text. Because you see the phrase there in green, "which has life." That refers to people and animals in contrast to plants. And the word life there is really a translation of two Hebrew words, nephesh, chaya. Nephesh is the Hebrew word that is translated soul or creature, depending on context in the Old Testament. And chaya is the adjectival form of the verb to live. So this is living creatures. Those two Hebrew words are never used in the Old Testament to refer to plants. They're only used to refer to animals and people. So when people or animals eat plants, they're not killing anything, because animals aren't really alive. Plants aren't really alive. So this text is indicating that the animals and the people before Adam sinned were vegetarian. And then we see in Genesis 9:3, after the flood, God gave permission to Adam, to Adam's descendants, Noah's descendants, to eat flesh. "Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you, as I gave the green plant." So the Bible is very clear that the pre-fall world was very different from the world that we live in today. The world before the curse of God was very different from the world that we live in today. And one of the indications of that is in Genesis 3:18, where God says he cursed the ground, and he says, "Both thorns and thistles the ground shall grow for you." So if God cursed the ground with thorns after Adam sinned, we've got a problem if we accept millions of years. And I have found from talking to a lot of theologians and reading the writings of theologians and Old Testament scholars that most of them have not thought about this point in their acceptance of millions of years. But we've got a problem. Because according to the evolutionists, there are fossil thorns in rock layers that are 300 to 400 million years old. If those millions of years are really true, then God lied. Thorns and thistles didn't come after Adam sinned. They were already in the creation for hundreds of millions of years. But if God is telling the truth, then those millions of years are a lie. They never happened. And by the way, God didn't curse the Garden of Eden. He cursed the land outside the Garden of Eden because he was expelling Adam and Eve out of the garden. So it was the world outside the garden that was cursed with thorns and thistles. But there were more consequences to that curse. In Genesis chapter 3, we're told the very first thing that God cursed was the serpent who had deceived Eve. And the text tells us, "Cursed are you, on your belly you shall crawl." So that curse had some kind of physical effect on the serpent. We can't be sure whether there was any morphological change to the serpent or just a behavioral change, but something physical happened. So the curse was physical in nature. But the very same verse says to the serpent, "Cursed are you more than all the cattle and the beasts of the field." So the animals were also cursed, which it would seem would imply some kind of a physical result. Then in verse 16, we're told that Eve was judged physically with increased pain in childbirth. She would have had pain before, but now she's going to have increased pain. And people will say, "Oh, well, pain, if there was pain, then there was pain before the fall. That shows your view is wrong." Well, listen, all pain is not evil. You have to have a little bit of pain to be able to recognize your surroundings, to know whether something is hot or cold. So not all pain is evil. All coaches in athletics know that not all pain is evil. Too much pain is bad, but a little bit of pain is good. It's not bad. So Eve had physical consequences to the fall. Then we're told in Genesis 3:19 that Adam is going to die physically, and the clear implication is Eve would too. And Romans 5:12 confirms that through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin. And that's talking about physical death. So that was another physical consequence to sin. Now man did die spiritually. He was separated from God. He hid from God because of his sin. But the text is really emphasizing the physical nature of the curse. And then, as I indicated, the